Neighbor Horror Stories, Volume 1, The Haunting of Apartment 305. Part 1, The Strange Arrival. I'll never forget the feeling I had the first time I walked into that building on Sycamore Street. It was a charming, red-bricked, three-story structure nestled on a quiet street in a small town where I'd just landed a new job. I'd been looking forward to a fresh start, and the old apartment building seemed perfect. Cozy enough that I'd have neighbors nearby, but spacious enough for a bit of privacy. The day I moved in was uneventful, which I was thankful for. After lugging up boxes, I threw myself onto the worn leather couch I just managed to fit through my apartment door. Apartment 302, my new place, was directly across from apartment 305. The hallway was narrow, the walls painted a faded cream, and an old light bulb flickered sporadically above me, casting strange shadows. I'd unpacked as much as I could that night before fatigue got the better of me. The next morning, I met a few of the neighbors, most of whom were either elderly or young professionals like myself. Mrs. Fletcher from apartment 101 greeted me on my way to work, her little dog Sammy sniffing eagerly at my shoes. She was a classic sweet old lady, warm and chatty, eager to tell me everything she knew about the building. Mrs. Fletcher had a motherly air about her, one that made you feel at home immediately. She filled me in on everyone who lived in the building, from Sarah, a grad student who liked to bake, to Tom, a grumpy accountant on the third floor who barely left his apartment. When I asked her about 305, she stopped mid-sentence. Her expression shifted as she said in a low voice, "305 has been empty for months." I thought she must be mistaken. I could have sworn I'd heard someone moving around in there when I was unpacking. She continued, "We've had a few tenants come and go there, but no one stays long." I didn't know what to say, so I laughed it off and thanked her for the info. But her words left a strange, heavy feeling. That night, I found myself looking at the door of 305 as I returned from work. It was plain like mine, except for a dark smudge by the handle, almost like a burn mark. I shrugged, chalking it up to the building's age. After all, what old place didn't have a few quirks? Later, as I was unwinding on the couch, I heard faint noises from across the hall. It sounded like footsteps, then maybe a chair being dragged along the floor. I glanced at my door, half expecting to see shadows moving beneath it. But the hallway was silent. I tried to convince myself it was just the building settling, but something about the steady, rhythmic sound of those footsteps unsettled me. They seemed to continue for hours, just pacing back and forth, occasionally pausing before starting up again. I turned up the TV volume and tried to ignore it, but it took a long time for me to fall asleep that night. The next few days were normal, or so I thought. I settled into my routine, got to know a few of the younger neighbors, and tried to make myself at home. But I kept noticing things that felt off. There was an odd, musty smell in the hallway near 305 that didn't seem to fade, no matter how much the cleaning staff came around. And sometimes when I walked past the door, I could swear I felt a cool draft coming from underneath it, as if someone had left a window open inside. One evening, as I was returning from a late shift, I saw him, the man from 305. He was tall and thin, with sallow skin stretched tight over high cheekbones and eyes that seemed sunken into his skull. His hair was dark and messy, falling over his forehead in greasy strands. He stood in the dimly lit hallway, fumbling with his keys in the door of 305. I tried to walk past casually, but I felt his gaze on me before I even looked up. Our eyes met, and for a second I felt frozen in place. His eyes were dark, almost empty, but they gleamed with something I couldn't place. Curiosity? Malice? "Evening," I managed to mutter, giving him a quick nod. He didn't reply. He only smiled, a slow, unsettling stretch of his thin lips, and watched me as I walked past. The moment I turned my back, I could feel his gaze burning into me. I practically sprinted to my door, fumbling with my keys, and when I looked back, he was gone. The door to 305 was closed, the hallway silent again. That night, the sounds from 305 started up again, only louder this time. There was a dragging noise, almost like furniture being scraped across the floor, followed by muffled thuds. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling my heart pound in my chest. I thought about knocking on his door to check if everything was okay, but I couldn't shake the image of his smile, the darkness in his eyes. Instead, I lay there listening until the noises stopped around dawn. The next morning I found a note slipped under my door. It was scribbled in rough, erratic handwriting. "Do not let him in." I stared at it, heart racing. Who could have left it? Mrs. Fletcher? One of the other neighbors? It seemed like a prank, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that someone knew something I didn't. I shoved the note in a drawer, telling myself to ignore it, but a seed of doubt had been planted. A couple of nights later, I came home late again and found the man from 305 standing in the hallway. His back was to me, and he seemed to be staring at something on the wall. I cleared my throat, hoping he'd move out of the way, but he didn't react. I took a few hesitant steps forward, noticing that he was muttering under his breath, too low for me to make out the words. When I finally got close enough to pass, he turned, eyes locking onto mine with that same hollow stare. "You're new here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just moved in a couple of weeks ago." He nodded slowly, his gaze never wavering. "Don't get too comfortable." Then he turned and walked back into his apartment, closing the door softly behind him. My heart was hammering as I made my way to my own apartment, trying to shake off the feeling that he'd just given me some kind of warning. The note under my door, his cryptic words, everything was adding up to something I couldn't explain. I thought about calling the landlord, maybe asking if the guy in 305 had some kind of history, but it felt ridiculous. What was I going to say? "I think my neighbor is creepy." That night I locked my door, double-checked the windows, and lay in bed wide awake. The sounds from 305 started again, louder than ever. Scraping, dragging, muffled voices. I felt an urge to go out into the hallway to see what was happening, but a strange paralysis held me in place. At some point I must have drifted off because I woke with a jolt to complete silence. The first thing I saw was a shadow beneath my door, unmoving, as if someone was standing right outside. I held my breath, frozen, and after what felt like an eternity, the shadow finally moved, fading down the hall. In the morning, another note was waiting under my door. This one was even shorter than the first, but somehow more chilling. "He's watching you." And that's where things truly began to spiral.